We turn now to the great design and development opportunities that open up in the older parts of cities as they grow and change. There are many big urban rail yards that are not being used anymore because their function has been moved to outlying areas. The piers that used to line urban waterfronts also became useless when shipping containers became the new standard. The old piers did not have the backup space for storing containers and transferring them to trains. So container shipping shifted to big new ports farther from the city center. The old warehouse districts near the tracks and near the piers also became outmoded as new ways of shipping freight took over. Railway yards, waterfronts, and warehouses have become the new frontiers of urban development, and the change has been going on long enough that we have already seen major transformations. This is a map of the Mission Bay district in San Francisco in the mid-20th century, when it was both the Santa Fe and Southern Pacific rail yards and a series of waterfront piers, all of them no longer needed today because of changes in the way freight is moved. And here's a recent photo of the same area. Since the 1990s, Mission Bay has been redeveloped with a mix of housing, university, and medical buildings. The development is about half completed. In the right foreground is AT&T Park, the home of the San Francisco Giants since 2002. The piers near the stadium have been replaced by a marina. Moving from San Francisco to London, this is one of the old warehouse buildings in the London Docklands. The warehouse has been preserved as a museum. Some of the other Dockland buildings have been repurposed as offices or apartments, but mostly the area has been completely rebuilt. This map shows how the London docks looked a century ago. They changed very little up to the 1980s, but today's large freighters can't get this far up the Thames River. Today, the Docklands have become a second financial center for London, and also a major residential district. The central section follows an urban design plan by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, but the rest of the Docklands has been divided up into separate parcels, and while there has been a great deal of new development, it missed the opportunity to have an overall design. Here's part of the central Docklands area, seen from the Thames River. There are many redesigned waterfronts around the world. We have already mentioned the reclamation of the waterfronts as urban neighborhoods being done in Helsinki, and here's another Scandinavian example, a relatively modest residential new waterfront neighborhood, Västra Hamnen, in Malmö in Sweden, with a tall apartment tower, which appears suddenly in the middle of it. The building is called Turning Torso and was designed by Santiago Calatrava. The changing role for freight railroads has also big consequences for cities. Railroads running through the city used to support factories on either side. Another kind of city design opportunity is available in the many places where these industrial constructions are no longer really working and are mostly vacant. You may have seen some of these broken and abandoned factories when you travel by train. Here's an example from Turin, or Torino, in Italy, where a derelict industrial corridor has become a new urban district. The tracks were rebuilt below grade, and a new urban district was created above the tracks and on both sides. The urban design plan is by Vittorio Gregotti. Sometimes the railway tracks remain, but the trains no longer run. A famous example is the High Line in Lower Manhattan. It was built to serve the warehouses behind the piers along the waterfront, as an elevated viaduct was needed so traffic could get to the piers. The piers are gone, and there was no more use for the railroad, but people came to like the ruined railroad where wild trees and plants had grown up along the tracks. It has now been saved as an urban park, partly with private donations, some additional public money, and a special zoning district which allowed the people who owned the properties under the railroad to transfer their building rights to next-door locations. The designers were landscape architect James Corner and the architectural firm Dilla Scofidio and Renfrew. The High Line and its predecessor, the Promenade Plantée in Paris, where an abandoned elevated rail line has been turned into a garden, has inspired other cities to look for similar opportunities. The Bloomingdale Trail in Chicago is one example, more of a neighborhood amenity, without the tourist and high-priced real estate that line the High Line. Here's what the abandoned Bloomingdale line, formerly a freight connection, looked like in 2013. And here's the completed Bloomingdale Trail in 2015. The planner for this project was Michael Van Valkenburg and Associates. In Miami, a proposal to landscape the space under a 10-mile-long rail transit viaduct, shown here, is to be called the Underline. The design is by James Corner Field Operation. Finally, there's a proposal to turn the disused underground terminal for trolley cars that used to run on the Williamsburg Bridge in New York City, shown here, into the low line with real greenery nurtured by skylights and special lighting, as shown in this experimental installation in a nearby warehouse. The low line is certainly an example of a plan to recover a forgotten urban place, although it's not clear why it should be a park rather than an exhibition hall or even a shopping mall. Another category of urban opportunity can be created when an elevated urban expressway is torn down, opening up urban space and releasing surrounding properties from its blighting influence. An early and important example of reclaiming urban places from elevated expressways was the removal of the Embarcadero Freeway in San Francisco after it was damaged in an earthquake in 1989. Public opposition had already prevented the freeway from being connected to the Bay Bridge, and to everyone's great relief, the decision was made to demolish instead of rebuild. One of the worst aspects of the Embarcadero Freeway was the way it went right in front of the iconic ferry building. Removing the freeway opened up the space in front of the ferry building, which was turned into a great urban plaza following a design by the Roma Design Group. No one misses the highway at all. Another very successful and expensive removal of a highway viaduct was the demolition of Boston's elevated central artery, shown here, replaced by an underground highway tunnel with a series of urban parks and some development sites where the highway had once been. This has been a very quick overview of the opportunities for recovering lost or forgotten urban spaces and making them into great places that enhance the city. Larry is going to go on to tell you in much more detail about three important examples: Battery Park City on the New York waterfront, which replaced a series of unused piers; False Creek North in Vancouver, which is both a waterfront development and the former site of an unneeded freight yard; and the Brooklyn Bridge Park, which replaced a cargo port. But before we go on to Larry's segment, I want to ask you a question. If you had been the designer responsible for laying out the Västra Hamnen neighborhood in Malmö, would you have included the 54-story residential tower by the famous engineer-architect Santiago Calatrava? Building the tower, the tallest building in Sweden, was probably more of a political decision about putting the city of Malmö on the international map rather than about enhancing the new neighborhood. Unfortunately, urban designers don't usually get to make such decisions. They have to work within their political context.